Good morning, everyone. I'd like you to open your Bibles to Genesis 47 and verse 9. Give you a moment to turn there. This is going to be the verse that we launch from in this series on the days of Jacob's life. So if you're there, Genesis 47 and verse 9 says, "And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers, the days of their pilgrimage." I want you to note that what Jacob has in view as he looks backwards are events. Days. We may mark our life, the time we mark by years, the passage of years, but our memory marks days, events. Days like the day that he left home and he was in that wilderness area and found himself alone and had to sleep upon a rock for a pillow. That's a day. And that's how we mark our life, events. And he's saying that the days that his mind reflects upon are, in particular, days of trouble. And so we're going to focus on that for a little while in this series and bring those days into view just to help us in looking at what is a pilgrimage in our life and what is trouble. Okay, so this verse tells us there's really two things that pop out about life. One, it's short. Life is short. And this is a man that lived 130 years, is saying life is short. And that means it's attended with hellos and goodbyes. And Jacob had his share of goodbyes in his life. He buried his wife, Rachel. That was a goodbye. He was met with tragedy in the day that Joseph's cloak was brought back filled with blood. He said goodbye to his parents when he fled from Esau. Then he said goodbye to Laban when he returned. So these hellos, these goodbyes, and these are things that are attendant with our life. And sometimes we say goodbye because people die, because people precede us in death. And there's comfort in the Bible around that. We have that in 1 Thessalonians 4, saying that we do not sorrow as those that have no hope. So if you're saved, there's a hope to see people again. All right, if you're saved, there's a hope to see people again. But yet it still hurts. It still hurts when people die. When people die, especially when they die young or in an unexpected way. So that's one thing. But then he says, few and evil have the days of the years of my life been. In other words, his life was attendant with numerous sorrows. Some were just, he didn't cause them, they happened. In Job, we looked at the verse that says, as the sparks fly upward. Okay, as the sparks fly upward, man that is born of woman is, again, few days, and as his trouble is as the sparks fly upward. And we talked about, well, what's the fire? What is he talking about in that analogy? Well, he's talking about the fact that the fire keeps producing sparks. And if one happens to land on your pants, it burns you. And the source of troubles, the source of fire, it's an analogy for sin. The reason that we have trouble in life, the reason people die, the reason we have difficulties with people, the reason that people misuse us, mistreat us, the reason that we mistreat and misuse other people, it's all sourced in sin. So the source of trouble, the source of pain, the source of death, the source of sorrow is sin. It's sin. Sometimes it's the sin of others. It's the sin of Adam that's passed on to all of us. It's the sin that that in some people's lives, their lives are like a raging inferno. And, people today have taken to calling that a hot mess or something like that, a dumpster fire. That's some people. And when these people cross our paths, they bring to our life sparks that hurt and pain. The first situation we talked about, and we, had you to write down the trouble maybe that you're currently experiencing or that you've recently experienced or that still affects you, and just to write it down as if the spark, as you think about it, because all of our life has these trouble sparks. So I think it's helpful to write it down, identify it. It could be a person. It could be what a person has done to you. It could be something that still leaves a hurt, wound, pain, or scar. It could be something someone's doing to you now. It could be a situation. It could be something that you've done to yourself. But this pain or sorrow in your life, without giving it any other category or description, it's good to write it down and to identify that this is something that troubles me, that I am troubled with, or is troubling me. It could be the death of a loved one or the impending death of someone. It could be a situation in the family, people close to you, in a marriage, in a parent-child relationship, sibling relationship. It could be a person that is against you, or a person that you're estranged from. It could be a lot of things, this trouble. And then what we're going to attempt to do is to give it some categories and look at the life of Jacob to help us have categories for it. I know when we were dealing with young people at youth camp, one of the counselors said the things that kids are dealing with today, there's no category for it. There's just no category for it. And it is true when you think about things, and he was involved in the juvenile system, and he was talking about, this horrible thing of like sex trafficking and things that are going on, and it's just, it's sin. It's sin. But to the extent that we might bring a category to it, the first thing that we mentioned was when a brother or friend turns it to an enemy. When a brother or friend turns to an enemy. Okay? That's a category. So that may not be the category of the trouble that you're facing in the moment, or maybe you've never experienced it in your life, but sometimes a friend or a brother becomes an enemy, an adversary, or an antagonist. And we saw this in the life of Jacob with Esau. One who was once a brother, a twin brother no less, one who they once grew up together. I'm sure, I don't know if they had bunk beds, but most of us that had siblings had bunk beds. We slept close proximity to each other. And so these brothers Esau became an enemy to Jacob. And to say that is his only brother, his only sibling, became an enemy and a sworn, avowed enemy. Esau said to everybody that was listening, I'm going to kill Jacob. As soon as Isaac dies, he's a dead man. So this was a hate. It says Esau hated Jacob. And Jacob, in these situations, you have two options normally, fight or flight. And Jacob took to flight. But that flight cost him. It cost him everything. He left with nothing. The lesson that we can learn from that is that God can change things. But it took 20 years. It took 20 years. So it took 20 years of time for Esau's heart to change towards Jacob, and for him to be able to put it away and get beyond it and realize, you know what, it really was God's will all along for Jacob to be the man. But sometimes it can take, and that's the difficulty of living with tough relationships, because you're thinking about it all the time. I'm sure when Jacob would go to sleep at night, he would think about Esau. And maybe it takes sleep from you, thinking about estrangement and fight and having to leave and all the desperation that put him in having nothing, put him in a bad situation. But, as I said in that, if Jacob had not known trouble, he would not know God. Because it was trouble that caused God to reveal himself to Jacob. It was God who appeared to Jacob 7 times. The first time he appeared was at the Jacob's ladder, showing that, in fact, God is active in all the details of our life. And the idea of an army of angels descending and going back into heaven reminds us that God is active. He is not, as some would portray him, like a grandfatherly figure that sits on a rocking chair, or a clockmaker that made a clock and just took his hands off. God wanted Jacob to know, I am active. If you run in the wilderness, I'm there. If you run to Laban, I'm there. Wherever there is to be, I am there. And it took Jacob some time to really come to full faith in God, but that was a beginning of it, you might say. All right, so that's Esau. It takes time. Sometimes we just have to live with the fact that, and if you have an enemy that's a sworn enemy or a vowed enemy, those can be difficult years. Because you're thinking, why? What? And it bothers you. It would bother any of us to have somebody, especially a sibling, especially a family member, that seems to have something against us. But it's also true that you can't fix it. You can't fix it. And so Jacob, God had to change Esau's heart towards him. You can't fix it. And so Jacob went away until God told him to come back. All right, that led to a second situation. So the first category you can give is an enemy, somebody that became an enemy that was once a friend, a brother, or a close person. Secondly, you have oppression. Okay, oppression. Jacob was oppressed by Laban. And I'd like you to look at that in 31:12. Verse in 31:12 of Genesis. Oppressors are people that have power. Okay, they have power, and you say, why do they oppress? And last week I said because they can. Laban had everything in his favor. The whole situation was in Laban's favor, and he took advantage of Jacob many times. And so sometimes you're in a relationship and you're saying, but the person is taking advantage of me. They're taking advantage of me. They're taking advantage of my kindness. They're taking advantage of my loyalty. They're taking advantage of my faithfulness. They're taking advantage of my labor and my work. They're taking advantage of me, and they're trying to control my life. That's a very difficult situation. But I want to point out in verse 12, God is speaking here. Lift up now thine eyes and see all the rams which leap upon the cattle are ringed, straight, speckled, and grizzled. But this is the point after the colon. For I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. That's what I want to draw out of that, is that even down to the animals that were wrongfully taken from him, God saw everything that Laban did. And that's one of the things in life that you say, well, that's cold comfort. But it is comfort because God sees everything. He sees everything that people do to us, and he sees how we handle it as well. And so we can cry out sometimes to God, you know, God, that I haven't. And Samuel said something was, I never took an animal, I never took a bribe, I never did any wrong to any person. But yet this nation's rejected me. And God said, they've not rejected you, but they've rejected me from being king over them. And so God sees everything. He collects our tears in a vial. He knows our downsitting and our uprising. He's not limited in any way. But you might say, well, if God knows about it, why doesn't he do anything about it? And in this case, it's the same 20 years. It's 20 years. 10 times has Laban changed his wages, changed the game. A lot of times you could say, why is it that we have in life an enemy? Why is it that a person becomes an enemy? Because life was never meant to be this way in the garden, but in a lot of cases, there's situations in life that become a zero-sum game. Does anybody know what a zero-sum game is?
He's still mine.
Yeah, if you have it, I can't have it. And if I have it, you can't have it. So that's the way a lot of games are played in life, is that only one person can have it, the birthright. Only one person can have it. Jacob has it, which means Esau does not have it. And we in life as Christians don't want to go through life playing zero-sum games, which is, well, if he gets to have that position, then I don't get to have that position. Or if everything that we look at is a matter of, I want that, but he has it, and so I'm upset with him. And that a lot of times brings adversity into life. Well, oppression by Laban. The point is, God saw it. God saw it. So, what's the answer in this situation? Well, again, we go back to fight or flight. Jacob could fight Laban, but as Christians, it's not the thing to do. Is to say, well, I'm going to show Laban. I'm going to give him a piece of my mind. Jacob decides upon flight. And this is very common as Christians. So often why we do get taken advantage of is because we don't fight. And we're going to talk about that today some. But Jacob decides it's just best for me to leave. However, silent separation is a worldly way of going about leaving. Okay, just disappear. Okay, just disappear. Just break a relationship with no explanation for why it's broken or no terms. That is what psychology will lead you to do. What they call oppression, they have a fancy word, but they might call it codependency or something like that. Like, I have this codependent relationship with a person. It's actually fine to have relationships where you need each other, okay? And you depend on each other. That's actually a good thing. Psychology has turned into a bad thing because they say you have to be, your own person. Okay, but in the case of when you're legitimately oppressed, you can get a third party involved. And in some cases, Jacob got a third party involved, his wives. And his wives said, Jacob, you're right. You're right. We understand. And we see that in verse 16. For all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is yours and our children's, now then whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do. So and we talked about this with Jonathan trying to make peace between David and Saul, saying, I'm going to make peace. Saul really doesn't want to kill you. But in the end, Jonathan came to terms with the reality that, you know what, it would be better for you to run away. Don't fight him. Don't fight Saul. And David did not fight Saul. He ran away from Saul. And there's a covenant in Scripture. We talked about the covenant last week between Laban and Jacob. And the covenant was this. Okay, here's a rock. You don't come over here. And I'm not going to go over here. Because we have to separate. And this happens in situations where we have to be separate because of oppression. And at least then everybody knows the terms. At least the terms are defined. And Laban, tried to, convince them, I'm going to miss my grandkids. And you have to understand, this was hard for the grandkids. I taught last year on the life of Joseph, and they mentioned the fact that Joseph's life started by being yanked away from his grandpa. He was maybe 9 years old, and he never saw him again. So it's something you don't want to do, But at times you have to say, well, this is the boundary. And for the purpose of the fact that there's been oppression here, we have to have a flight, but we're going to talk about it. We're going to say, this is the agreement. And it's at least more noble to do that than to simply just gaslight or disappear. Now, let's look at the agreement between the house of Saul and the house of David negotiated by Jonathan in 1 Samuel 20:16. Because these are the situations that cause pain. I mean, David really never did anything wrong to Saul to deserve this. But yet, he is the one that has to take it and run away. So we see two examples of this in Scripture, and we talked about how the book of Hebrews says that a covenant is made between men. It's 1 Samuel 20 and verse 17. A covenant is made between men, and a covenant is an agreement before God, by the way. So when we say marriage is a covenant, not a contract, it's a covenant agreement between two people before God. So Jacob and Laban made an agreement before God that they would separate from one another, and that Laban wouldn't harass Jacob, and Jacob wouldn't mistreat the wives or daughters of Laban. And they both kept to those terms. Doesn't mean it didn't hurt, though. Like I said, Joseph grew up without grandpa, and that was a sudden change in their life that they had to experience as a family. But it had to happen. And the third party, in this case, the wives said, yes, it's got to happen. Hebrews 6:16, by the way, is the verse that I'm mentioning. But anyway, Jonathan tried to make peace between Saul and David, but it did not work. So, verse 16, so Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord even require it at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan caused David to swear again because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. And what did they swear to? Well, it's verse 15. But also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one, from the face of the earth. So the agreement's simple. Most of the time when a new king takes over, he wipes out the previous king's posterity. That's very common. And so Jonathan recognized that David was meant to be king over Israel. His father would not relent on that point. He wanted Jonathan to be king. Jonathan knew there was not any way that they could bridge that gap. That David and Saul were going to have to go their own ways. So he negotiates a peace and says, I'm going to have you swear before God you will do no harm to our house when God establishes you. And that was the agreement that was made, and David kept the agreement. He didn't persecute the house of Saul, even for all the things that Saul did to him. And, of course, David was on the run for many years. The kingdom was established in David's hands when he was 30 years old. Okay, 30. He was probably anointed when he was a mid-teenager, like maybe 15. And he did his great exploit against Saul, probably around 15 or 16 years old, against Goliath, And then he had time when he lived with Saul, and he was at Saul's table. He was Saul's bodyguard. He was Saul's musician. He was Saul's son-in-law. And then the breakup happened. And it probably lasted for 8 to 10 years. A long time before God put an end to the house, or to the reign of Saul in battle. And it was not by David's hand. Okay, so that's the second category, is oppression at the hand of an authority figure. Laban or Saul.